Good evening, everybody. As if on cue, you're all brilliantly silent and we're ready to go. So a really warm welcome to this evening's South Hampstead Speaker Series. If I don't already know you, perhaps because you've joined from a partner school or you are an alumna, then I'm Vicky Bingham, the head, and I'm delighted to welcome people from across the school community. The speaker series has been running now for 5.5 years, and we've welcomed a large number of high-profile speakers to shine a light on a diverse range of issues. During the pandemic, the talks went online, and I believe this is the first that we've had back in person, so we're really excited to welcome a real-life audience. I am absolutely thrilled this evening to introduce you to a leading foreign correspondent and a best-selling author, Christina Lamb. Christina grew up in Morden. I spent my formative years in Morden, actually, a place that she's described as one of the dullest places in South London.
Apologies to anybody from Morden.
So we won't talk about Morden this evening, but her life has been very far from dull. After attending an all-girls grammar school and reading PPE at Oxford, an unexpected wedding invitation took her to Pakistan at the age of 22, where she became a war correspondent, apparently by accident. She began her journalistic career in Afghanistan, covering its war against the Soviet Union, heading to Kandahar at one stage on the back of a motorbike with a group of mujahideen. Within 2 years, she was named Young Journalist of the Year, and some 3 decades later, she is the Sunday Times Chief Foreign Correspondent, and she's won more than a dozen major reporting awards. Over the years, Christina has covered wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Angola, Syria, and most recently in Afghanistan and Ukraine. But the stories that she's most interested in telling are not, as she puts it, the bang-bang fighting of war, but some of the underreported stories of women. So Christina, a huge thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for
It's a real honour.
And great to be doing something in person, and also this has been long in the coming.
Yes, perhaps the audience might like to know actually that we've had to reschedule, I think, is it twice?
Well,
because of Christina's
also
war
the
reporting
pandemic.
and the pandemic, exactly. So the first question actually I had for you was just to tell the audience a little bit about how you became a war correspondent, because I understand that you initially wanted to be a poet, I think had romantic notions of living in a garret, but that wasn't how life ended up. So tell us about your journey into being a foreign correspondent.
Okay, it's quite a long story, but basically when I went to university, one of my friends one day asked me if I wanted to go to a cheese and wine party. I don't think they exist really anymore. It's a very sort of 80s or 70s thing. But
we had one last year.
Oh, did you? All right, sorry. Sorry, I thought they... Okay. A fashionable kind of thing to do. And of course, being a student, the idea of free cheese and wine was very attractive. So I had no idea what this party was for. I just went along. When I got there, it was for the university newspaper. And so people were all talking, editors of different sections, about what they were doing. And I thought, actually, I really like writing, and also I'm very curious about people. My mum would say I'm nosy. And so I thought, this actually sounds like something I'd like to do. So I signed up and ended up editing that paper. So that was sort of my introduction to journalism. When I left, so I was at Oxford. When I left university, I got an internship at the Financial Times just for the summer. And I went to work there. And one day, the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians. And last minute, he couldn't go. So he said to me, "You're always going on about India. Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went, and they were expecting the foreign editor, and they got this sort of recent graduate. But they were very nice about it. And I sat next to somebody from the Pakistan People's Party, which was the opposition party in Pakistan. And at that time, Pakistan was under military dictatorship of somebody called General Zia. And Benazir Bhutto was the leader of the opposition, and she was living in exile in London, actually in the Barbican Centre. So this man from her party asked me if I'd like to interview her. Of course I said yes. So I went to interview her. The day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to somebody called Asif Ali Zardari. And so her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I'd never seen so many. And so it kind of made the interview more newsworthy as well. She then went back to Pakistan, and I got a job as a trainee reporter at Central TV in Birmingham, which was kind of by accident because I didn't really want to be a TV reporter. But anyway, so I go to work in Birmingham, and I was the most junior person in the newsroom. So I was covering sort of, really very local issues. And one day I came home from work, and on my doormat was this most beautiful gold inscribed invitation I had ever seen in my life, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Karachi. So of course I went to this wedding. I didn't have any money because I just started working, so I had to borrow money for the flight, and she kindly arranged for me to stay with her secretary. And the whole thing, when I look back, is very odd because it completely changed my life. She'd only met me once, and she basically invited me like a friend. So I went to all of the family get-togethers. If any of you have from South Asia or been to a South Asian wedding, you'll know that they go on for a very long time and are very big and very colourful. And Benazir, being who she was, hers went on for a week and was very, well, to me, it was like something out of Arabian Nights. It was absolutely fabulous. And every night when we came back from these commemorative events, there would then be a gathering with her political colleagues to discuss how to topple the military dictator. And these people were telling me about, being arrested, tortured, tear-gassed. The most dangerous thing I'd ever done was find my way home late at night if I missed the last train. So I was really astonished by these people, and also the fact that they were doing this to try and bring democracy to their country, something I guess I'd always taken for granted. So I thought, I don't really want to go back to Birmingham and cover flower shows and things like that. I want to live here. So I went back and gave him my notice. And in fact, the last story I ever did for Central TV was a man who turned his car back to front, so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going back. So I go to Pakistan, but when I went to talk to foreign editors about freelancing in Pakistan, nobody was interested. They all said to me, well, General Zia's been there forever, nothing's going to change. And I was like, no, but Benazir's gone back. She's going to launch this movement and topple him. And they just thought I was silly, basically. But they said to me, we are interested in Afghanistan, because at that time, the Soviet Union, as it was then, had invaded and occupied Afghanistan, so rather like the situation in Ukraine today. And so they said, if you could go into Afghanistan, which borders Pakistan, we'd be very happy to have coverage from there. So I went and lived in a place called Peshawar, which is on the border with Afghanistan. If any of you have read any Kipling, it's a place that he writes about and didn't really look very different, with the sort of wooden buildings all leaning on each other, and the tribal elders carrying guns on their back as casually as umbrellas. And so I was fascinated by this place, and also I just fell in love with Afghanistan and started traveling in and out and covering them fighting against the Russian forces. So that's how I started.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. We will come back to talk about Afghanistan a little bit later, but I'm really glad you were rescued from flower reporting in Birmingham. So you received a wedding invitation from Benazir Bhutto. You also, in 2013, were awarded an OBE by Her Late Majesty the Queen. And I thought, given recent events, I just wanted to ask you, about the legacy that you think Her late Majesty will leave on an international scale? Because I gather you've had quite a lot of messages from friends all over the world about her following her death.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very sad time. I think many of us were surprised at how sad we felt, probably older people among us. She's all we've ever known, and you know, she seemed to represent what was good about the country and the stability at a time that we seem to be going through a lot of instability. So, you know, like many people, I was really sad at what happened. I have to say my mum was devastated because she hasn't been on holiday for years because of COVID, but also she was looking after my father for a long time. So she finally, last Thursday, boarded a boat to go up the Nile for her first holiday for years. And of course, then the Queen died, so she's on a saga holiday with lots of elderly English people. And they're all really upset that they're missing the news back here. So that was a bit sad. But no, I mean, I feel, to just answer your question, I mean, I think David Cameron, I'm not sure he's somebody I necessarily want to quote, but he spoke of her as being our most experienced diplomat. And I think, you know, that there's a lot to be said for that, you know, she brought something different. Everybody wants to meet her. Everybody remembered meeting her. You know, the convening power of the royal family. We talk a lot about soft power in diplomacy. They were able to sort of broach issues and talk to people that the government necessarily couldn't always do so. And so I think that was really important. And just the fact, you know, you look at the figures, she lived through 7 popes, she met 5 of them. I think, was it 15 US presidents, of whom she met 13 or 14 US presidents. And, you know, she knew everybody, and she really, I was quite friendly for a while with somebody who used to be her sort of foreign relations advisor, and she really took an interest in everything and was really well briefed. And so I think, you know, that's a great loss.
Yes. That we've lost a lot of knowledge, actually. So this event, as we mentioned, was originally scheduled for earlier this year, and then of course Russia invaded Ukraine, and you went to report on the war, and you've also, Christina, just returned from Afghanistan a year after Western forces pulled out. It's probably a rather large question, but do you think you could give us some insights into the year that you've just had so that the audience gets a sense of what it means to be a foreign correspondent?
Actually, it's been a crazy year because, well, maybe I should start with a year ago, because when the Taliban took over Kabul, so I've been going to Afghanistan, it's been like the main, I've covered many things, but Afghanistan's my passion. I've gone back and forth for years. And my editor really wanted me to go to the Amazon last summer to do something for the run-up to the COP26 conference. And I wanted to go, but I was also very conscious of the situation in Afghanistan. But at that time, people still thought, you know, it was going to take a while for the situation to really deteriorate. So I went to the Amazon. I didn't just go to the Amazon, I went to a really remote part of the Amazon, which involved several flights, then driving for about 8 hours, then going on a boat for about 6 hours, then going on a canoe, and then walking. So I get to this place, and I thought I'd be completely cut off when I got there. And to my surprise, there was a little sign in one of the huts that said Wi-Fi vouchers. It was in the middle of nowhere. So I was like, you know, Wi-Fi? And they said, yeah, we have like the Wi-Fi hour once a day with the solar panels. So of course I went on the Wi-Fi the next day, and immediately my WhatsApp just lit up with all these messages saying, are you all right? So I was thinking, why would people ask me if I'm all right? I'm in the Amazon. And then lots of messages from friends in Afghanistan saying, I'm desperate, please help me get out. So then I realized that something had happened in Afghanistan, but the Wi-Fi wasn't on long enough, nor was it strong enough to actually like really get proper news or anything. So anyway, I guessed what had happened. I had a satellite phone, so I called my editor, who said, come back and go to Afghanistan. I was like, I've just taken a week to get to this place in the Amazon. I think Kabul fell on a Sunday, so it was Monday then. So she wanted me to get there for the following Sunday, but we worked out that with the best will in the world, there was nowhere I could actually get there until Sunday. So we decided that I would stay in the Amazon for a few days and properly do that story, and then make this mad dash to to Kabul. So, which is what I did. And it was quite funny because when I finally arrived in Kabul, other journalists there were all telling stories of how they'd been on holiday in France and I was like, you can't beat me. I came from the middle of the Amazon. So that was kind of mad. And it was also, I mean, Vicky was asking me earlier about what had been the most difficult story. I mean, it was just completely heartbreaking going to Afghanistan and seeing the Taliban everywhere. And after all these years of covering all of the international involvement, all the fighting, all the attempts to educate girls and change things there. And so it was really, really hard to get your head around. And so at that point, I mean, it was as if all of the life had been sucked out of the country. I mean, there was no women to be seen, everything was closed. I've subsequently gone back 2 more times, including just now, and it's still, even on the 3rd time back there, it's still really difficult to quite grasp, you know. This is the biggest humiliation that NATO has ever suffered, but for the people living there, their lives have just fallen apart, and particularly, of course, girls and women. And most of my meetings, particularly that first time, but even since, with girls and women that I know there, you know, ended with people in tears, and people saying to me, it would have been better if you'd never come here, because actually you, the West, gave us hope and dreams, and now we can't do any of those things, and it would have been better not to have been educated, not to have had any of this. I don't actually agree, but I could see why they feel that.
I mean, that must have been really hard to hear, that potentially the words of foreign correspondents, had sort of given them false hope, and the West coming in had given them false hope. And we were talking about what hope there could possibly be for particularly girls in Afghanistan. And I know one of the charities that you'd like people to support this evening is to promote girls' education. But what hope is there for the people of Afghanistan?
You know, some very brave women who have stayed behind and have set up projects and are trying to educate girls secretly. So it's back like it was when the Taliban were in power in the 90s. So there are these sort of clandestine schools. The one difference from the previous time is girls can go to primary school, but it is the only country in the world where girls are banned from going to high school. And some places tried to open high schools, but the Taliban have closed them again. So the only option that girls over 11 have is to go to these secret schools, but of course they're very few. So these projects, you know, I don't want to give a false sort of idea of them, are only managing to cater to a very tiny percentage of girls and women. Most women are not allowed to go to work. They're allowed to work if they are teachers or if they work in hospitals. Some of the NGOs have women working for them, but most women are not able to go to work. And so, you know, people are calling it gender apartheid. It is, you know, women don't have rights. Taliban keep imposing more and more restrictions. Most recently, they said that they don't recognize divorce. And so it's extremely difficult for women and girls being there. But there are these few brave, you might have seen some have come out and protested, which is an incredibly brave thing to do when the Taliban are in control. I find it very telling that no men have come out and protested. And one of my sort of bugbears, I suppose, in what I've seen of when we've intervened in different countries and when we talk about women's rights in some of these places, there is no, in my view, there is absolutely no point in teaching women about their rights if you don't talk to the men about it too. And that is what happened in Afghanistan. People flooded in, set up gender awareness courses for women, made women aware, girls, of the rights that they should have, but didn't speak to the men at all. So didn't change the male mindset. And that's why, you know, men are accepting the situation there. And it's these few brave women that are coming out. But there's not a lot of hope, I have to say.
And I was wondering, Christina, when you went out to Afghanistan a year on, I mean, how easy was it to get access to the women to tell their stories? Because I imagine a lot of them must have been really afraid of telling their story. Did you find that difficult?
Yeah, well, obviously a lot of women fled who felt that they were at risk, and some of us were involved in trying to get them out too. But some decided that they should stay and try and make a difference. And those people mostly do want to speak because they want people, they need help. And so they want people to know that there are some women there still trying to do something and not just forget, because that's sort of the feeling I think that they have, that at the beginning everybody was outraged, the Taliban have taken over, how can you possibly stop girls going to school and women going to work? But a year on, they're still in that situation and people are not talking about it so much, and so they're very concerned that the world's just sort of moved on and sort of accepted that this is a situation.
So you must feel a real responsibility actually to tell their story.
Yeah, I think people need to keep going back and forth, and interestingly it sort of seems to be women reporters that are more attracted to going to Afghanistan. So there's a group of us like Lise Doucette, you probably heard of, and Lindsay Hilson from Channel 4, and we all go back and forth, but I think, you know, find it very difficult now. And interestingly, the Taliban haven't stopped us reporting at all. On the contrary, actually. I mean, it's kind of funny because what's happened is, so Afghanistan under the Taliban is not recognized by any country on earth. But they still have embassies everywhere from the previous government, including in London. So that embassy, the ambassador is from a government that doesn't exist. So he gives us visas for this government that doesn't exist. We then travel to Taliban-ruled Afghanistan and are allowed in, and then have to go and get a letter from the Taliban allowing us to report. And they usually give us a sort of lecture. So the last time I went in, they said to me, you can report anything you like as long as it isn't baseless. So, okay. The one thing that's sort of positive, and for Afghans as much as for us, is that the war has stopped. So actually we can travel to places that we have not been able to travel before. I just, on my last trip, went south to a province called Zabul, which is very much pro-Taliban, and so, but had a lot of fighting, and so I wouldn't have been able to go there for years. So it's interesting being able to do that, but I do think at some point the Taliban are going to start feeling, why are we allowing all these foreign journalists to come in, because they just write critically about us. And I think, so if I go to Iran, for example, it's very difficult to get a visa. And if I do get a visa, I then have to have a minder when I travel around Iran, and I suspect the Taliban might do that too.
You mentioned Lise Doucette, and I was just thinking, as a female war correspondent, you're in a comparatively small group. I suppose, does that make you feel that you've got perhaps a responsibility to kind of provide a different voice and to share different sorts of stories?
So things have changed. There's a lot more female correspondents now, which is good. When I started, there were very few. And I must admit, I wasn't really very aware. So I lived in Peshawar. I knew that most of the other reporters were male, but I didn't think about it that much. And you also have to bear in mind, I mean, that was the late 80s. There was no, if you can imagine, no internet, no mobile phones. It was really quite difficult sending my stories back to London. I mean, we used to have to use something called a telex, or there was an international operator. So Afghanistan didn't have phones at all. I couldn't report back when I was in Afghanistan. I had to wait till I came back to Pakistan. So often I'd be away for weeks, then I'd come back, and then I'd have to usually bribe the international operator to get a phone line and then dictate my story to London. And so it was a very elaborate process. These days I can file a story from the top of a mountain in the Hindu Kush or in the middle of a desert. In fact, during the war in Iraq, it was funny because we'd been told that mobile phones wouldn't work in southern Iraq, but I had my phone, and suddenly on the second or third day, my phone rang. So I answered the phone, and I'd been looking for a house, and it was Foxton's estate agent. And this guy, I'll never forget, he said to me, "Oh, Miss Slam, we've got this excellent property and very near an excellent school and beautiful features, original features in the house." So I said, "Oh, look," I said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm actually in Iraq in the war. This is not very convenient." So he was only momentarily phased being from Foxton. It was Foxton's. And then starts saying to me, "Yes, but this is a really great opportunity." So sometimes it's quite good not to be able to have phone contact. But anyway, there's a long way around of saying that because then I never saw my stories. It was like I was filing into a black hole. I didn't see what other people wrote, so I didn't really have the same. Now I see what everyone else is doing. So it really wasn't very aware about it. But I think because I was a woman, I was much more interested in what happened to women in war. So I was always trying to find out what the women were doing. And it also seemed to me much more interesting. And because I told you, I didn't want to be a war correspondent. I don't like war. I don't like people fighting each other. I hate all the, what we call the bang bang. But I am fascinated by how you live when a war is going on. Because if you think about Ukraine, to take a current example, but Syria or other places that have been still at war, millions of people are still living in those countries, still trying to go to work and get married and have children and send their kids to school. So I was very interested in, how do you do that when a war is going on? How do you keep life together? And of course, it is mostly the women that are doing that. So always, from the beginning, I always spoke to women much more. And I wasn't really very aware then that actually other reporters weren't particularly doing that. I became much more aware. I looked at our coverage when I came back from the first part of the war in Iraq, the bit where we thought the war was over, but in fact it wasn't. And I realized that there was 8 of us then from the Sunday Times. We had much more staff than now. That we hadn't quoted any women. And I think just maybe 2 women had been quoted in weeks and weeks of coverage. And they were kind of quoted like, the widows of people that had been killed as passive people, not like they had any kind of role in what was happening. And I was horrified. So actually that made me much more aware when I realized that. And 3 of us were women that were among the reporters doing this, that we must report on what's happening to women. It's the untold story of war. They have been written out of history far too often. And so I became much more focused on doing that.
So one of the books, Christina will be selling some of her books after the event, but one of the books which I'm reading at the moment, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, has been described by the historian Anthony Beevner as the most powerful and disturbing book he's ever read. and it is a shocking set of chapters on what happens to women in war. I was reading it on the tube the other day, and I had to stop because I was just crying. It was truly, truly shocking. And I suppose I was thinking about what compelled you to write the stories, because I understand the news desk wasn't always that receptive to the idea. And then I suppose on a personal level, how do you as a foreign correspondent talk to women and girls who've suffered such unspeakable atrocities?
Well, I just mentioned about feeling that women, to me, that the real heroes in war, even though there's no statues to them. But there is also this dark side, and that is the use of sexual violence and brutality against women and girls. And unfortunately, I've been a foreign correspondent now for 35 years, and I would say in the last 7 or 8 years, I've seen much more of this than at any time in my career, which I found very confusing. I mean, why should something so terrible be happening on such a scale? The first time I became really aware was in 2014, 2015, when the Yazidi girls were captured in Iraq by ISIS fighters and taken to be sex slaves. And they were taken to this place called the Galaxy Cinema, where they were divided up into ugly or beautiful, and then the fighters would come and choose a girl. And so the girls were trying to make themselves look uglier so that they wouldn't be taken. And just hearing the horrendous stories from them of how, you know, some of these girls were just traded from one fighter to another. One of the girls I met was sold on 12 times, and she said she felt like a goat. And so these stories were so horrible, and I just was really shocked. But the women and girls were telling us, journalists, what happened. I mean, these are really hard stories to talk about, you know. And so they were bravely telling the stories. And I mentioned to you earlier how my job has changed in terms of communication. So one of the ways is everybody you interview pretty much stays in touch with you because you're on WhatsApp. And so I would be interviewing these Yazidis, and then afterwards they would message me saying, we told our story, what difference did it make? And I couldn't answer the question, and I was really actually shocked, because I thought I told these stories like other journalists of these most horrendous things you could possibly imagine, and nobody did anything. And around the same time, you might remember the Chibok girls in Nigeria who were abducted from their school in the middle of the night, more than 200 girls, by Boko Haram fighters, and disappeared. And that became like the biggest story on earth for sort of 2 weeks, and then everybody moved on. And the girls, I mean, we're now 8 years on, 100 of those girls are still missing. And so when I went to report on that and travelled around northern Nigeria, I found that thousands of girls had been abducted, that actually this was just the tip of the iceberg. And again, the same thing, they were telling of what happened. In fact, their stories were really horrible, because not only were they taken by Boko Haram fighters and then raped, but then when they were rescued, the Nigerian military would often rape them again, and then their own families wouldn't take them back because they saw them as being sullied, and so they had no way of kind of supporting themselves, so they were victims over and over again. And then in 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya crisis happened, and the Burmese fighters were going into villages in Myanmar and setting fire to huts and killing men and raping women. And so around 650,000 people fled in about 3 months into Bangladesh. And again, they were telling the same kind of stories about being tied to banana trees and gang raped. And so I just felt really useless, actually, that I was writing these stories about these people and nothing was changing. and also angry about why was this happening on such a scale and nobody was doing anything about it. So I started really to investigate more. And as you said, it was difficult to write about it because I had a male foreign editor who said to me, nobody wants to read these stories. And so I just started researching and trying to understand why it was happening so much. And it soon became clear that it was really, although war rape is a war crime, it is the most neglected war crime. It was really difficult for anyone to get any kind of successful prosecution. The first success was in 97, 98 by some brave women from Rwanda who came forward and got a mayor from a small town convicted. But you know, since then there's been very few. Accountability is really the exception, not the rule. So I started, you know, collecting stories of women in different places because I think it was also important to realize that I think sometimes people think, oh, there's something that happens far away, and but actually I went to 12 countries on 5 different continents. This is happening in so many places. And sadly, of course, this year we've seen it happening in Europe, in Ukraine. And when people first started contacting me, they're female activists, and saying that this was happening, I didn't really believe them to start with. I thought, surely this can't be happening. But then the stories became too many, and then, you know, we've all seen, and yeah, it's really shocking. But the only positive thing I think about what's happened in Ukraine is that it has been really widely reported, and President Zelensky has put the rape as important as the killing and torture. And that is really unusual because I think one of the problems is usually people have seen the rape as some kind of side issue that isn't as important at the end of a war as killing and torture, when obviously for the women it's happened to, every woman I spoke to pretty much told me that she'd rather have died than gone through what she went through. So, you know, it shouldn't be regarded differently. And it's impressive to see in Ukraine, you know, even as the conflict is going on, that war crimes trials have already started.
I mean, you mentioned in, I think, near the beginning of the book, how sadly sexual violence, you know, has been part of warfare for centuries. You know, Herodotus's histories open with a rape and abduction. At the end of World War II, the Red Army raped a lot of women as they swept through Eastern Europe. But you also comment in your book that in the last few years, you've never seen anything on this scale. And I wondered what you thought was driving that, because it really is horrifying.
Yeah. Well, initially I thought maybe it's just that, you know, people were speaking about it more, and but it can't just be that, because the numbers are too many. And no, I really think it is because nobody's being prosecuted for it. So there's, you know, perpetrators they can just get away with it. So, and it, unfortunately, rape is the cheapest weapon known to man. I mean, when I talk to militias about it, they say it's cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. It's very effective if you want to clear a village because you want to take over lucrative minerals, as happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or you want to clear out people of a different ethnicity. Going in and raping the women and girls is a really effective way of doing that, sadly. So, and nobody, as I said, is being brought to justice for it. So they think they can just get away with it. And that's what really needs to change. And it's very infuriating to me that the international community at the United Nations passed a resolution about this called 1325 more than 20 years ago, which was to say that we need to do something to reduce sexual violence in conflict, but also to increase women's participation in peacekeeping and peace negotiations. I think the two things are related. And unfortunately, in those 20 odd years, there's been very little progress. I mean, I think the sexual violence and conflict has gone the wrong way. There's more. There's been very little prosecutions, and we still only 5% of peacekeepers are female. There isn't a single peace process around the world that's headed by a woman. Most have very few women involved. So why is the international community, every country, including Russia in the UN, voted for this resolution, and yet they're not doing anything serious to implement it?
Christina, I just had a couple more questions before we throw the questions open to the floor. I wanted to ask about one of the other books that you've written, which is I Am Malala, which you co-wrote with Malala. And I just wondered if you could tell the audience how that sort of project came about and whether you were still in touch.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of our pupils have read the book.
So yeah, Malala is one of my favourite people. People often ask me, like, how can you do this job that you're going to bad places writing about bad people? But actually, in those places, you find people doing the most amazing things. To me, they often seem to be women, but maybe that's because I'm a woman. And Malala is one of those people. It was amazing working with her. And basically what happened, as I said at the beginning, I started off my career in Pakistan. I've gone back and forth. And the first book I wrote was a book called Waiting for Allah, which came out in Pakistan in 1990. It came out here, but Malala's dad actually read that book when he was a student. So when Malala was shot, I actually was based in Washington as correspondent. And I didn't know Malala. I was horrified, like everybody, at what happened. But I had been to Swat, where she's from, and when the Taliban first took over there, and had interviewed her father, a man called Ziauddin. But I didn't put them together because I didn't know he had a daughter called Malala. At that time, she wasn't known, and he was quite well known as an activist, and their surname is very common in the area where they're from. So I then come back to London from Washington, I go into my office, and my editor said to me, then Malala had just been moved to England to be treated. Is there any chance, do you think, of interviewing Malala? So I said, I don't know, maybe. So I go on my email, and astonishingly, I had just had an email from a literary agent who said that she was agent for Malala. And would I be interested in writing a book with Malala? So I said yes. So I went with her to Birmingham. Now, Malala had just come out of hospital a couple of days before that. And it was very strange because when we got to so they had been put in a sort of tower block in the centre of Birmingham. When we got into the building, and there was this sort of short man with a moustache waiting at the lift at the bottom of the building. And I said to him, I know you. And he said, yes, I'm Ziauddin, I'm Malala's father. And so then I put together that actually this was his activist. So that was one of the reasons they'd contacted me, because he remembered me interviewing him, and he also had read this book that I'd written years before. So we then go upstairs, I talk to him, and then I'm sort of interviewed by Malala, who was then 15.
What did you make of her in that first
meeting?
So
I have to say, when I was a bit unsure. I'd written books, but I'd not written a book like with someone else telling their story in someone else's voice. So I wasn't really sure this was something I particularly wanted to do. And also, I was supposed to be doing something else. Anyway, so I go there. And then when I met her, I just was so taken by her. I mean, she just had so much sincerity and so much poise. She was this young girl, but also she was funny and so warm. So she came in with tea and then sat next to me, and she said to sit this side of me because her eardrum had been burst on one side by the shooting. So, and then we chatted, and I just really immediately wanted to work with her because I just thought she was incredible. And And she was very short. She made me laugh because she wears, even then she was wearing high heels because she hates being short. And so if you ever see her doing a talk, always have a look because she wears like really high heels. And we just started chatting. And I mean, one of the things I feel strongly about in my work as a foreign correspondent, going to different places, that the thing that I've seen makes more difference than anything else is educating girls. So meeting this girl who risked her life to try and get girls educated, and whose passion was about educating girls, just really, really wanted to work with her. So then I spent a lot of time with them, staying in their house. And my son is the same age as her. She has 2 younger brothers, so her next brother, Kushal, was the same age as my son, so they got on quite well. And it was quite funny because Kushal and Malala really had a bad relationship. They fought all the time. So when
I'm glad someone as amazing as Malala fights with her younger brother. That's kind of reassuring.
So when she got the Nobel Peace Prize, my son said to me, "Mummy, how did she get the Nobel Peace Prize? She fights all the time." And her younger brother, Atal, who then was about 12, and she went to speak at the UN on her 16th birthday, and her name was sort of up in lights. And he said, "But Malala, what have you actually done?" So in a way, it was great, because I think that's what, she's the most down-to-earth person. And at the beginning, when I first started working with her, you know, every time I went to her house, there would be this amazing bunch of flowers on the table, and I'd say, "Oh, that's beautiful." And she'd say, "Oh, the president of Sweden came to tea," or, you know. And then she got sent iPod, and it was from Bono, and he'd downloaded all these U2 songs on it. And she
did that on all our iPhones as well. Do you remember that album that all appeared?
And so, and I thought, oh my goodness, this girl's going to be completely spoiled because, you know, having all this attention. But she's completely the same. She's so down to earth. And I think it is because of her family that they tease her, and they have this really good relationship. So it was wonderful working with her. And yeah, we're still friends. And in fact, when the Queen died, I spoke to her last week because she went to meet the Queen, and so she was recalling her meeting with the Queen, and how Prince Philip had made her laugh because he said to her, "Well, we all want kids to go to school so we can get rid of them from home."
I'm sure a familiar feeling to our audience. For a moment there, we nearly went full circle. We were back in Birmingham. And actually, I do want to go sort of full circle with my final question. You talked about how you became a war correspondent. Now, not everyone is going to be invited to a very famous politician's wedding in the future. So what advice would you give young people in the audience this evening who are thinking that perhaps they would like to follow your intrepid journey, Christina, and become a foreign correspondent?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy if anybody does still want to become a journalist or a foreign correspondent. I think, you know, a lot of it is luck, right? But being in the right place at the right time. But you have to know how to use your luck if you get it. But listening to people, and everybody has a story. And determination, I think, is probably the most important quality, and persistence, because most of the time I'm going to places where people don't want me to be. And so, you know, managing to sort of talk your way into places is also quite important. But I see a lot of journalists, and I find it strange that when they go to interview people, start telling them what they think about the situation and don't really listen properly to people. And I find that very odd. And there's a lot also, I often say this to people starting out as journalists, but don't be afraid of silence. Like, actually, if you go and talk to somebody and then you don't say anything, then people don't feel they need to fill a silence, so they may start telling you things that they wouldn't say otherwise. And actually, we haven't really talked about Ukraine, but that has been a real joy to work in as a journalist, and that here is a country where they want journalists to come and report on the war. So everybody was incredibly helpful everywhere. We went slightly disconcerting because, as I'm sure you've heard, that Boris was very popular. So every time going through a checkpoint and you'd say press Britansky, they would say, oh, we love Boris. So one of my colleagues would say, you can have him. But a friend in Ukraine also just sent me a picture of a mural of the Queen, which was very nice in Dnipro. And the one, I mean, I said to you how depressing Afghanistan is. Ukraine seems like good news the last few days, and which is amazing. Let's hope that continues. But, you know, they've taken back more land in the last 3 days than the Russians have taken since April. So that is really something.
It might be that a member of the, because we've covered so many different topics, Christina, and it might well be that somebody in the audience wants to ask a more detailed question about Ukraine. I'm going to hand over to all of you. I believe there is a microphone. So if anyone would like to ask a question of Christina, could you raise your hands? I can't see you all terribly well, but I can see a hand sort of round about towards the back there. Go for it. Is it Kaya? Yes, I can see you now.
So far, what has been the highlight of your career?
Ooh, that's a difficult question to answer. Probably working with Malala, actually. It was very special doing that. But, I mean, funny things happen. I mean, you wouldn't do this job, right, if it was all kind of doom and gloom all the time. There's always, even in the middle of the most what appears to be a depressing situation, then funny things happen. I always remember actually after Benazir was killed, and I was terribly shocked because I knew her very well, and in fact I was on her bus when it was blown up and she wasn't killed, but then a few months later she was. And I went to Pakistan and I kind of thought, how is Pakistan going to get over this? It's just such a shock. And arrived at Lahore airport and got into a taxi, and I said, and of course journalists, we always interview taxi drivers, and how are things in Pakistan? And he said, oh, not good, you know, situation's so bad. And so I said, yeah, you know, and I was expecting him to say something about Benazir, and he said, you know, the problem is we have no discos in Pakistan. So there's always these sort of funny moments, even in the middle of chaos.
Another audience question. Is that Sophia?
Yeah.
Yes.
You talk very casually about kind of being in horrific situations, like you just said you were in a bus that blew up. And I was just wondering how you keep kind of a balance between being able to report on all these things, but also keeping yourself, you know, like healthy mentally as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, I don't want to make light of, you know, obviously I spend a lot of time, any correspondent who says they don't get scared in these things, don't believe them or they're mad, because, you know, it's very scary sometimes and difficult. But I'm really care enormously about telling people back here what's happening, and always feel that the people themselves in these places, the risks they're taking, you know, I can fly away at the end of the day, but they're still there. So it's important that we go and cover what happens. But when I'm back, I try, we were talking about this earlier, because there's a club in London, which actually I'm going to later tonight, called the Frontline Club for War Correspondents. And so there's this idea that war correspondents hang out and tell each other stories of wars they've covered and basically drink a lot. And I'm very rarely actually meet up with other journalists. Most of my friends here are not journalists. I like going to the theatre. I like kind of walking in parks and looking at trees and remembering that there are beautiful things to think about, and reading poetry. And also I'm a mother as well, and so I think that in a way was very helpful. I mean, my son's now 22, but when he was younger, and I was away a lot. My husband was looking after him. I couldn't then come back and say, oh, well, I'm going out drinking with other war correspondents, and sorry for that. I would have to take over being mum and taking my son to football practice and doing all the things that my husband had been doing. And so I think that was very grounding, actually. So it meant, sometimes it felt like I was living a double life. I mean, crazy things happened. I remember my son was having a bake sale at his school when he was at primary school, and I'd always missed the bake sales because I'd always been away, and this time I was there. So he said, Mum, you know, it's my class bake sale, you must come to it. And then that day, one of my best contacts from Pakistan intelligence called me and said, I'm in London and I'm only here today and I've got something to tell you and we must meet up. So I said, okay. And he said, and the only time he could meet me was basically the time of this bake sale. So I said, I'm really sorry, I can meet you any other time, but not that time. So he said, well, what's so important that you can't change? So I actually told him and said, it's a bake sale. So he actually thought this was very funny. So he came with me to the bake sale. He bought £10 worth of cupcakes, so the class was very happy. And we talked during the bake sale about, it was after 9/11, and it was about Al-Qaeda, and so it was slightly bizarre, but yeah.
That's a great story. We can got room for one final question. Yes, Mrs. Scott.
I just wondered how you managed your personal security if you were popping in and out of Afghanistan and Pakistan, particularly in the 80s when the Russians were there. Like, how did you must have taken a lot of risks, I suppose, in terms of...
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I talked earlier about how the communications have changed, and for the better, really, but the security side has unfortunately worsened in that we've become targets in a way that we weren't really. I mean, when I started out covering the war in Afghanistan then, you know, if anything happened to you as a journalist, it was really because you were unlucky, you got in the middle of something, or you did something stupid, but nobody was trying to kill journalists. Both sides sort of respected that we were there to cover the war. That's changed a lot, and we've had, you know, like Islamic State, where they were kidnapping journalists, making videos, and you know, with knives at people's throats. And one of my close colleagues, Marie Colvin, who worked for the Sunday Times, was killed in Syria, which really brought home the danger. And, you know, for a while, it seemed, you know, there were places that had become too dangerous to cover. So that, you know, Syria at one point, lots of it, places like Raqqa, you just, you know, if you went there as a Western journalist, you were going to get kidnapped. So that changed things quite a lot. And in fact, at that point, that's when I went to work in Washington, because I thought I can't do my job anymore the way that I had. But fortunately, things are not quite like that now. I don't really travel with security. I just travel, I'm very much, because I'm a writer, I can be very low profile. It's not like TV where you've got cameras and things. I'm mostly on my own and travel in like local taxis, and so that's my kind of security, getting local information. When we went to cover Ukraine earlier this year, all the news organizations had security consultants, and that was really the first time I'd ever worked with a security consultant. And I found that quite difficult, because he wants to know not just what I was doing tomorrow, but what I was doing next week. And mostly I don't even know what I'm doing today. So he wanted, like, you know, a detailed program so he could check things out. And, you know, it's not really how I work. I like go to places and then find what's happening. And so that was quite weird, but I appreciated having somebody, you know, that was there if anything happened. Then newspapers decided it was too expensive, so now we don't have security consultants anymore. Mostly the TV people tend to, but I think most British newspapers don't have. So, but we get sent on these hostile environment courses to places like Kent and Berkshire, where we run around fields and people put sacks over our heads and pretend to kidnap us, and so they're supposed to learn how to deal with it.
I'm sure some parts of Berkshire. Really.
Well, I have to tell you, the only place that I've ever been mugged, Morden.
Was Morden. We were talking about Morden because Christina grew up in Morden, and I spent my formative years there. But yes, Morden.
So there we
yes, who'd have thought it? Christine, there is so much that we could continue talking about, but I'm conscious that people would also like to buy some books, and Charlotte would also like to say thank you. So I'm going to invite her up for a moment.
Christina, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk this evening. We are so privileged to hear you speak on such an important and underrepresented issue in the world today and throughout history as war violence against women, so thank you for that. What particularly resonated with me was your comments on how women's experiences during the war, particularly with violence, are often a kind of neglected aspect of war. I study history and I'm looking to do it further, and so it's always really important to me to make sure we fully understand events and how they affect people. And so we really appreciate your work in making sure that we do get that full picture, particularly in women's experiences. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone that hearing your stories today have been incredibly affecting and have really changed the way that we view war and that we read the news, so thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you Mrs. Bingham for your fantastic questions. And can I please ask everyone to show their appreciation for Christina one more time with a round of applause.
Goes with mine.
It's been such a privilege to have you here, Christina, and I'm so glad that we were eventually able to bring you to SHHS.
And I hope some of you do become journalists.
And I really hope some of you do. It is a noble, noble profession. And I suspect that Christina will have inspired some of you in this room to think about it. I would also like to say thank you to anybody who has supported the speaker series over the years. The series is partly funded by donors in our community, and I just wanted to say that Christina has asked for her entire fee for this evening to be donated to 2 charities. One is a project led by Afghan activist Layla Hadiri, which helps girls to go to school and get an education, and the other charity is Too Young to Wed, which helps girls who are forced to marry at a young age. And we will circulate those links to you, so if any of you would like to make additional contributions to those 2 charities, then I'm sure that would be really welcome. Out in the atrium, we have copies of some of Christina's books, and she's going to stay with us for another 25 minutes to sign those. So I'm going to go out to the atrium with Christina, and we're going to form a beautifully orderly South Hampstead queue. Thank you very much, everyone.